Cleve.
Sean.
Darling.
Yes.
I've been fortunate to hear you speak many times over the years.
Blessed indeed.
All sorts of, blessed indeed, in all sorts of circumstances. But today you were on fire.
Thank you.
And it was a really wonderful talk and inspiring and all stuff with your personal story. But what I want to ask you about is you were very specific about what you see as an important agenda for our community of things that are being neglected. And, you know, I think one of the things of doing this work for a long time that is frustrating, you sort of look back and you realize, you know, I said that 25 years ago. Yeah. They'd only listened to me then, you know. And I had the sense today when we were hearing you that what you're saying today is something 10, 15, 20, 30 years from now, people are going to say, we should have listened to what Cleve said. So I want to give you a chance to sort of go through those points again, and maybe we'll reach a few more ears.
Well, really, we should have thought about it 30 years ago. And but I think what's clear to more and more of us every day is that the world has once again changed profoundly. And if we look at LGBT lives, just in the span of our own lifetimes, we've seen incredibly profound changes in the way we live. That rate of change is now accelerating. And a big part of what's happening that is inevitable, that we cannot control, is that the neighborhoods in which we lived are changing. People are being displaced. So those neighborhoods that nurtured us, those places that we fled to when we were young, where we went if we were sick, where we needed help, where we needed safety, that provided an enormous amount for the LGBT movement and also for the HIV/AIDS movement in response to the pandemic. And this dynamic is not just about us. It's the same thing that's happening to traditionally African American communities, Latino communities, in my town, Chinatown.
Excuse me, but I want to make a distinction here because this was something that really crystallized when we were talking yesterday and today. Is that for a long time, and you know, my work with the direct mail and the demographic stuff, we'd always talk about the growth of the neighborhoods really after World War II, when a lot of soldiers came back and in the port communities and so on. And I always sort of compared that to immigrant communities, right? You cluster together. The first businesses in that were social, were places to get together.
Up the economic ladder.
The first wealth created in those immigrant communities is in small businesses serving each other. So, and there was an inevitable process sort of towards assimilation. Something different is happening now that's about money. And
so the pattern you just described, I believe, though I'm perhaps not as good a historian as you, but I suspect that's really been in place since the Industrial Revolution. That the inner cities were that place for the refugees fleeing famine and political persecution, wars, whatever. And the new arrivals lived cheek by jowl in tenements. They were poor districts. They would be poor the following generation and the generation after that, though the families would move up the economic ladder and move out. Now those same areas are claimed by the wealthiest of the wealthy, the 0.1%. So in my town, it means that all of the traditional neighborhoods, whether they're Chinese or Latino or LGBT or African American, are being decimated. I mean, with the African American community, it's already happened. It's basically been removed. Now,
well, cite that statistic from when you moved to San Francisco.
When I moved to San Francisco in 1972, 1973, the African American population was 17%. It is now less than 3%. And that has a real impact on the way people live their lives, what's available to them, what's available to their young people. It's been devastating. So we are now facing that. This is being driven by forces that we can't control. Now, some people believe that, this is because LGBT people can now live everywhere we want. And certainly, LGBT people have more options. But no, we cannot live anywhere we want. That's delusional. Other people think it's technology. We don't need gay bars to meet each other. Well, no, many of us don't. But That's really not the point, and that's not what's driving this. It's economics. It's money. It's the wealthy claiming the inner cities that used to nurture us and give us that political base, the creative energy, and the ability to provide the specialized social services.
And that expand on each other. Those are the 3 points that you made, that the erosion of the neighborhoods is posing a risk to us because it was when we had concentrated population where we could first elect our Harvey Milks and had that access to the delivery of specialized services when you had sort of a critical mass in the community.
I think that's a really part of it. People don't really understand the economic scales and how that works. But for people like us who are long-term HIV survivors, probably the single most important factor to our survival was our ability to access qualified, specialized care.
Right.
Now, when we're all dispersed out into the hinterlands and the suburbs, it is simply not economically viable for those kinds of practices to exist. When we look at our transgender friends, again, it's so important that they find that kind of specialized care and treatment. You're not going to get it if you're living in some distant suburb or small town out in wherever. And you know, each one of these 3 factors is critically important because when we lose the political power, we lose the ability to elect our own, we lose the ability to pass funding.
Right.
You know, that's really important. And a lot of people don't think about it. They think, oh, it's great to have somebody have us represented. Well, it's more than being represented. It's you know, having the ability to get the money to pay for your programs. And I'm also really concerned about the cultural vitality part of it. The LGBTQ community for so long has been able to really sustain our own cultural energy in a way that's been very exciting. And it also relates to funding because we raise money that way. My neighborhood, the Castro, produced so many firsts. And now the people that live in my neighborhood are, you know, increasingly not gay. They're wealthy tech people. And I don't know where we're going. And that's, so the other part was, if like when you talk to gay people from New York City, you know, when you and I were young, the scene was mostly in the West Village, and then it moved, part of it moved to the Upper West Side, part of it moved to Chelsea, now it's Hell's Kitchen, now it's going away. Pretty soon, there's going to be nothing left, no identifiable gay neighborhood in all of Manhattan. That really troubles me.
So you suggested some solutions, some strategies.
Yeah.
And you used the example of the Mission District in Chinatown in San Francisco.
Okay, so in my town, if you look at the, let's look at 3 examples that aren't LGBT. Let's look at the African American community. The African American community was basically forcibly removed. In my book, I refer to it as the twin engines of redevelopment and gentrification. Entire blocks of houses that had been owned by middle-class black families, sometimes for 2 or 3 generations, were condemned, destroyed, moved, and the Fillmore, an African-American cultural center that was known all over the United States, was decimated. Chinatown is holding on. And they're subject to enormous pressure from developers and the politicians the developers have purchased. But they've managed to hold on largely because they organized not-for-profit housing development corporations back in the 60s and 70s. They bought huge buildings in which entire generations of Chinese American families have lived. And that has kept their cultural identity, and it has kept their political power, and it has enabled them to provide the social services, especially to their aging population. The Mission District is under even more intense assault now from the developers, and because a considerable percentage of the folks living in that neighborhood were not documented, it hasn't been quite as strong a resistance as in Chinatown. But again, the Mission Housing Development Corporation, I think, owns 16 large buildings. Now, in the big picture, 16 large buildings is a drop in a bucket. But when you're trying to hold on to a neighborhood, that's key. We have never done this.
And the people we want to speak to, we have these tech gazillionaires that are gay, that have enjoyed a freedom of a gay life that was created by others.
Yeah.
It was created by others. And fortunately, many of them are funding gay things, but that's where the concentration of capital is that could come in and make a significant kind of difference in preserving some of these neighborhoods and the cultural vitality and the ability to deliver services. How do we make that happen? You also mentioned credit unions.
I think there's a couple of strategies, but there's one fundamental challenge is communicating the urgency of these issues to folks whose wealth protects them from feeling any urgency about it. Wealthy people can live wherever they want and do whatever they please. So I'm not sure exactly what the argument is, but I think in my mind, it's pretty clear that we need to build a national credit union that can really begin to harness the economic power of the LGBT middle class and to some extent the wealthy. When I look at the hills around the Castro, there's enormous wealth concentrated in that real estate. It's strange to me that we've never done this before. And as I mentioned earlier in my talk today, there's a number of examples where credit unions have been able to play a really significant role in meeting the needs of a crisis situation. But it's a way to really harness our economic power. Nonprofit housing development corporations, again, it's not rocket science. It's been done over and over. It takes commitment, it takes capital to make it happen, but it can protect vulnerable people, it can sustain your middle class. In San Francisco, the entire middle class is being removed. It's just really, it's an appalling situation. I'm also interested in community land trusts. I think that's another model we can follow. And I'm going to be writing some stuff about this soon. I'm going to try to get it printed in June. I want to get people talking about it.
Well, and there are some wonderful examples. Philadelphia, I know Mark Siegel at the PGN has been very involved with the LGBT senior housing project that they've opened there. Relatively small scale, but it's not starting from scratch. No. There are things, and we need to look at those and really scale them up, because otherwise, a few decades from now, the neighborhoods, as we've known them, as they were created and as they were so important to so many lives, are going to be a relic of the past. They are going to be.
Oh, it's not going to take a few decades.
It's going to be.
It's going to be in a few years.
Well, there's some there are some places where they are being supported somewhat because they're tourist attractions.
But even so, I live in one of those places. So one of the things I learned while I was on my book tour, I was really paying attention to this issue as I was traveling, and I was talking, for example, if you look at Halsted Street in Chicago,
Boys
Town is going to continue. Boys won't be living there.
Touche. It's like Little Italy in New York.
That's the model I use. You stole my thunder. So I was going to say it's like Little Italy. You go to Little Italy, there's Italian flags, there's Italian music out in the street, there's Italian Saints' Day parades, Italian food. There's no Italians living there, and there haven't been for a long time. One of the reasons why Halsted Street, I think, is going to survive for longer than many is that is one of the few cities where the gay business owners own the buildings and the land the buildings are on. Now, in my neighborhood, the Castro, there is only one bar owner who owns his buildings, and he's kind of widely despised. He's not, I don't want to get into it, but he's not particularly seen as a community-minded person. It's the reason there's no lesbian bars left in San Francisco. None of those women owned the buildings and the land. So when there's this enormous, force of gentrification and income inequality, so I think it's all about if we understand that the neighborhoods have value, political power, cultural vitality, ability to provide specialized social services, then we need to come up with the strategies to protect them and sustain them. And I think that's about buying the land, buying the buildings, and doing it on our own. Now, in San Francisco, some wonderful people have worked incredibly hard for a very, very long time to provide our first LGBT-designated senior housing. But they did that in a partnership with government, which prohibits them from discriminating. And other communities have done a much better job of mobilizing people for those lotteries. You know, when that kind of subsidized housing becomes available, there's usually a lottery system. You've got to mobilize people, you've got to work the system. So ironically, in San Francisco, our first fledgling attempt at providing this kind of housing for seniors is probably only going to be about half LGBT people.
So, and then we need to get groups together where we create our assisted living facilities so that we can spend our sunset days.
Yeah. Good luck with that. You know, I mean, in California now I actually spoke to a group, I'm not going to identify them by name, but it was a for-profit corporation that does high-end retirement assisted living facilities, and they are expanding into the LGBT market.
Right.
There's one in Santa Rosa that narrowly survived the terrible fires that were up there in Sonoma County. But these are only for the privileged few.
Right.
So, and it's going to be, I think it's a huge challenge for our brothers and sisters in particular, because so many of us did not retain the affection and support of our biological families. So many of us were sick for a long time, were out of the job market, never were able to reboot our careers. During that time in our lives when we should have been amassing wealth and saving money and putting it away in our 401ks, we were on the front lines of a war. Many of us suffer from what I would call post-traumatic stress disorder. We lost most of the people that we loved, and some of us still have physical medical issues. So I think we're a very vulnerable population, and it will be interesting to see if the generations following us care enough about us to help or not.
Well, let's hope they do, because we care a lot about them.
Yeah, let's hope.